Seahawks fans, wherever you may be. Thanks for listening to the show. Join your hosts, Bill Alvstad and Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Hey, Seahawks fans. Welcome back to another episode of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, sitting down with co-host Keith Myers, as usual, and we've got a special guest in today's show. Dan Viens from the Seahawks Forever Podcast is joining us. Good friend from for the show. Has been on several times over the years, and it's been a little while, been a little minute. I think in the off season we had you on, and the season just kind of went along, and it's been a little while. But I wanted to have you on today because we've just got so much to talk about, and we're going to try to put it all together in kind of an off season strategy session where we just talk about all the issues. First and foremost is going to be the head coach situation for the Seahawks. As we all know, we've moved off of Pete Carroll. Now we're looking at a new head coach, new regime in general, which is going to dictate some roster changes. John Schneider has got a chance to really run this franchise the way that he wants to run it, put his stamp on things, and we're going to talk about all of that. Going to get into some salary cap things, some free agency, some roster decisions that need to be made soon. Dan, Keith, both welcome in.
Always good to join you guys, and you're right, the season just kind of flies by and gets away from you. But the offseason lends itself better to these kinds of roundtables and discussions, I think, and especially this one, because it certainly has changed.
Yeah,
absolutely.
This is a kind of a unique off season for us in that, so ever since Bill and I started doing this, we've had Pete Carroll here.
You've done nothing else.
Yeah,
right.
And so an off season with coaching changes that are, systemic changes, not just like, oh, we changed a coordinator or that kind of stuff, but the entire flavor of the franchise is going to change. That's a big deal. It's something we haven't covered before.
Yeah, it gives us something new to talk about, something we've never had to explore before. We speculate about it, right? We've been speculating about it for the last 2 years, probably in a little bit more of an increasing volume. And now we face the reality of big changes, and that can be scary, but it also gives guys like the three of us a lot more to talk about.
Absolutely. And just in the last hour before we push the record button, there has been a few announcements on some scheduled interviews now for that position with John Schneider and company. First one up, Tom Pelissero said that Dan Quinn has officially been requested to interview for the position. I'm just going to go through quickly the other three, and then we can talk about those as well as others that we might have in mind as well. Let's see here. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. Defensive coordinator for the Rams, Rasheem Morris, requested for an interview. Offensive coordinator for the Miami Dolphins, Frank Smith, Tom Pelissero is now reporting is going to interview. That's an interesting candidate for me. Might be maybe on top of the list so far as the guys that are being interviewed. And the last one I'll mention is Panthers defensive coordinator Ejiro Evero is requested to interview. Just quickly, if you want, go back and forth. How do you guys feel about the names so far mentioned?
Well,
go ahead, Keith. You start.
Raheem Morris was one that I brought up in our last show. A guy. I know he was a failure as a head coach back when he got his first job, but he was 33 then, and it's been 15 years. And he's been a good coordinator since then. So I'm intrigued by that name. I'm not sure I'm ready to go down that road. Evero has been a defensive coordinator for 2 years on 2 different teams. Neither of those teams have been good.
Yeah.
I don't like the idea of turning the culture of this franchise over to a person who has been a coordinator level for 2 years on bad teams.
Bad teams, but their defenses are interesting. So the Broncos in most metrics were a top 10 defense with a really dysfunctional offense 2 years ago. I think that's commendable. And then you look at that Carolina defense this year, and I had to, you know, we all have a perception in the moment when we hear news like this of, you know, what we think that team has done. And I honestly, in that first second, because I wasn't expecting him to be a candidate, but maybe we should have been, and I'll touch on that in a second. I honestly couldn't put a finger on off the top of my head whether the Panthers were a good defense this year or not, other than, you know, what happened when they faced us. And I know they have a couple of good players, but you look at them and they were bottom. They were 28th or 29th in points allowed, right? They gave up 24.5 points a game, but they were 4th in yards allowed. I mean, I don't know how to wrap my head around that other than they had a bad offense with a bad rookie quarterback, and maybe they had some short fields they were facing and just didn't perform well in the red zone and gave up, you know, turnovers. But the thing to keep in mind about Evero is that there's a connection there, right? John Schneider is going to get big time inside information from Scott Fitterer, who's very, very, very close with John Schneider, the recently fired GM of the Panthers. And so, you know, John's going to know what that guy's like in the building, what his leadership skills are like. So that's why that one is interesting to me, just because of the connection there with Schneider.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great point. The interesting, we can talk about Dan Quinn a little bit, but the real big interesting one for me is Frank Smith. Now, we haven't talked about Frank Smith very much, Keith, at all, but the offensive coordinator for the Dolphins, previously a run game coordinator for the Chargers, and kind of turned that thing around for them before he was hired as the OC for the Dolphins. Dolphins came in 2022 as the 26th ranked overall offense, both yards and points or nearly that. And this year they've improved to 6th overall in those categories. And in fact, the NFL Players Association recently had a survey among 1,700 players and asked them to rank their coordinators, offensive coordinators in the league on a scale of 1 to 10. And Smith came in as the top offensive coordinator across the league in that vote. Just kind of a curiosity type thing to mention. But that would be an interesting choice if you're looking for a young, up and coming, offensive minded head coach. The opposite end of the spectrum there would be Dan Quinn. We can talk about both these guys. What do you think of the Frank Smith option first?
That's the curveball on this list so far, just because he's jumped around a lot. He hasn't really set his roots down in any one organization for very long, and he's never called plays. He doesn't call the plays in Miami. That's Mike McDaniel's baby, and he's not the only offensive coordinator that has that title in the league and doesn't call plays. But when you're looking at a head coach, I've been trying to tell people this ever since the news broke about Pete Carroll, that it's not just watching a game that the guy coaches as a coordinator and trying to judge how good his unit is, right? Like, so many people watched that Texans game yesterday and they're in love with Bobby Slowick all of a sudden because his offense looked so good in that game. But how can the guy run an organization, and how can he lead an entire program? It's a whole different ballgame, right? You're more of a CEO than you are an actual coach in many cases. And think back to 2010 when the Seahawks, or 2012 when the Seahawks drafted Russell Wilson in the 3rd round. And we all knew going into that draft that they were looking quarterback, that they needed to look quarterback if they weren't, that they had to identify a young quarterback moving forward. And so there were a lot of interviews leading up to that draft with John Schneider talking about, what are you looking for in a quarterback? And do you guys remember the phrase he kept using over and over and over and over again? It's a guy that tilts the room, right? A guy that when he walks in, you know, forget about the tape. You just feel like he's special, and he's someone that can lead your squad, and he's someone that can handle the responsibilities that go along with being in the spotlight like that. I would think if that's how he views the quarterback situation in his first chance to hire a head coach now, you multiply that times 100, right? And so, you know, how good of leaders are these guys, and can they get guys on the same page? Can they get them all motivated and working together? Because I think that's one of the points we can probably agree kind of led to this change, is they had lost their way when it comes to that, right?
Well, and I think that was the problem that I had with Evero is, his defense in Denver 2 years ago was a top flight defense despite having one of the worst offenses in the league on the other side of the ball. But he's never been a coordinator level on a team that wasn't terrible. So he doesn't know he's never seen from at least from a, what I would consider management level, he's never seen a successful organization being run.
Yeah.
So how is he someone that you feel confident in that he's going to come in and be able to do that for you?
That's what's tricky about so much of this. I look at, you mentioned Raheem Morris. He's a guy that's intriguing as heck because of what he does as a coordinator, obviously, right? How great would it be to steal that guy away from one of your rivals in your division? We saw what he did with that defense with a roster that we all thought at the beginning of the year was Aaron Donald and a bunch of guys, right? Well, it turned out to be much, much better than that. And he deserves a lot of credit. Failed before. That's never really been a true indicator of whether or not you can succeed again. Some of the best coaches ever have been fired before. But then there was that stint he had in Atlanta too, wasn't there, where he took over? Who was fired when he was there? Was it Dirk Cutter? It was he took over late in the year and did well. And there was a lot of player sentiment for him to be retained, similar to what's happening with Aaron Pearson in Vegas this year. And so you just don't know. We don't know how John Schneider views these guys as far as being overall leaders. All we can look at is scheme and results on the field.
Well, one of the things that we keep coming back to, that is the unknown in this is John Schneider himself.
Yeah.
What is John Schneider looking for? What kind of a stamp on the franchise does he want to make? Does he want to swing it out of the park and hit a home run? Obviously, but does he want to do it with what we would consider a safe pick, or would he want to really try to go out and grab one of these guys that's up and coming before anyone else has a chance to get him, and create a partnership with a new style coach that can compete head on with the coaches in the NFC West primarily? Here we have in front of us right now Dan Quinn. Previously, it had his experience in the Seahawks organization, was the defensive coordinator here during the 2 Super Bowl years that Seattle had. Before that, he had 1 year here previously, and then went on to be the head coach in Atlanta with some success, took him to the Super Bowl. After that, things kind of fell apart, returned to be a defensive coordinator, has now resurrected that, had an awful game. Everyone can agree yesterday that everyone is thinking, well, that's going to take his name out on the list. No, I don't think so. One game, yeah, it's bad. It's a bad look, but you also have to share that blame with the players on the field as well. They did not execute, obviously. But they did have a number 6 overall defense in the NFL this year. And so all of those things considered, obviously, with Dan being invited to interview, they still have him on the list. So how do you guys feel about Dan Quinn?
I'll be shocked if he's not the guy.
Yeah.
If it comes down to it, because he checks the boxes, right? I mean, he's a guy that has the experience, that ran a franchise. Not only has he seen one run really well here in Seattle, but he went and ran his own, and the culture was never a problem. The problem in Atlanta was that the GM was terrible and let just the talent level of that roster just evaporate. And so he had basically, if it was baseball, we'd say it was a minor league team out there and that he was trying to coach at the end of it. So he was never the problem. But the culture of the team, the franchise, everything that was there, that was never the problem either. He's done that. He's been there, done that. And he's been a successful coach. I see him as being the guy that checks the boxes. You were mentioning about, I want to get one of these young up and coming guys, the next Sean McVay or the next, like the guy in Miami now. You know how many of those fail compared to the one that hits?
Most.
The hit rate on turning coordinators into head coaches is worse than the hit rate on quarterbacks.
Can John Schneider afford to fail?
No.
Can he have a 1 or 2 year coach and have a reboot? Does he have that leeway? Or does he need to make this thing work right out of the gate?
I think he needs to make it work, because hanging over all of this, and there's still some unknowns about this. There's lots of varying opinions, but this is a team that's going to be sold at some point. And so, if you don't succeed in the next 2 years, if you blow this coaching move, you might not have a chance to make the next decision, because a new owner, especially if the team isn't performing on the field, is very likely to want to clean house and bring in his own organization, right? So he absolutely has to nail this, and that's why it is such a fascinating thing to see, or what we're going to see is John Schneider's first chance to call the shots, unencumbered by, another vice president who has final say on rosters in Pete Carroll. And we know that John Schneider, let me back that. We don't know how he operates in a vacuum, because we've never seen it. We only know how he operates with Pete Carroll having final say on decisions. And so we're going to find out, we're going to talk a lot about the draft this year and free agency. We're going to find out over the course of the next couple of years, based on the moves he makes, how we think those differ from how they were under Pete Carroll. But when it comes to hiring a coach, I think from everything I know about John and all the data points we have over the last 14 years and all the interviews and even interacting with him personally, I think he's a guy that gets a charge out of making the big swing, but I think he wants to win. And at the end of the day, he doesn't care about what the fans are going to think about this move. He doesn't care about how splashy it is or flashy it is, how much attention it's going to garner. At the end of the day, he's going to choose the guy that he thinks gives him the best chance to win now and moving forward. And Dan Quinn's a known quantity. And if he has thought for the last couple of years, because he's been preparing for this, right? He's had a list. He's been going through the behind the scenes motions of getting ready for this day for a long time. That's just how he operates. It's how any good manager should operate. But if he's thought for the last couple of years that when this job opens someday, if I have a chance to call the shots, if Dan Quinn is the guy that I think gives us the best chance to win, then I don't think that changes just because you want to make a splashy hire. But he's going to look into all this, right? He's going to do all his due diligence. So it's one of the fascinating things about this. At the end of the day, he may just go with the known quantity and the thing he knows he can count on in Dan Quinn.
Well, Dan, you mentioned the idea that John Schneider wants to win. And I've thought that from the very beginning. It's like, man, there's some guys out there in Seahawks land calling for guys like the Lions offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, to be the head coach. There's not even a second choice. The Ravens DC, Mike McDonald. Those are great guys, up and coming guys, smart guys. I understand from everything that's being said about offensive coordinator Ben Johnson from the Lions is he's just amazing. Like at his job, at identifying talent, putting players in position to be successful, all that. I don't know what he's like in the larger scheme head coach job where he puts it all together as a culture for an organization. I don't think anybody does. But
no.
When it comes to that culture thing, when it comes to the gravitas of commanding your locker room and all your players, Dan Quinn's got to be close to the top of the list, if not at the top. That's why I was looking at coaches that had maybe that experience variable that we're looking at. Guys like Mike Vrabel, for example, the Titans head coach, who's very well thought of, kind of a surprise firing there with that organization. And maybe a guy that might be overlooked a little bit in this process that spent some time in the Seahawks organization, Dave Canales, the offensive coordinator with the Bucs. I thought maybe if there's going to be a young guy having an opportunity, maybe it's a known quantity that John's familiar with in a guy like Dave Canales. Is there anybody else?
Canales has had 1 year as a coordinator. That's it. And it wasn't a great year as a coordinator. Like, okay, people go, hey, he made Baker Mayfield look not pathetic, so therefore he must be a great coordinator. That's literally his resume. I don't understand why his name's coming up.
He had some amazing success there in their run game and with two wide receivers having over 1,200 yards.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying, receiving. Like, he doesn't have a track record. The other two names that you mentioned, the coordinators in Baltimore and Detroit, at least those guys are coming in having seen really good cultures. I mean, what Dan Campbell has done in Detroit is crazy considering how awful it was when he arrived. I mean, it was as bad of a culture as you're going to get outside of
Agreed,
Washington.
100%.
And he turned it around, and now it's a great place to be. And Harbaugh in Baltimore has run one of the best organizations for, I don't even know how long he's been there, decade or more. These are people that really get it. They know how to do it. They know how to manage it. So these are coordinators that are coming in, that those are their mentors. Those are the ones that they've learned from. And I'm much more comfortable with those guys than, Canales or Evero, who honestly, haven't seen it. They haven't been a part of it. So
yeah, I'd be absolutely shocked if they hired someone like that, or even Frank Smith, like someone that just hasn't really had that position of authority for a long time. I think we're in a position where, let's not forget how attractive this job is, with supportive ownership and the fan base and a strong GM who's been there for a long time and a history of winning and a roster that's ready to win now. I think what's been frustrating for those who do what we do and for the fans the last couple of years is regardless of how you feel about Pete Carroll or schemes or X's and O's, I think most of us can agree on, we all felt like the talent was there to get more out of that roster than that staff was getting. That a better defensive coordinator could have had better results with those players this year. And so
yeah, there's a lot of talent there.
It's a team primed to win, and it's a team that has a pretty darn good quarterback in place. You don't have to blow it all up. It's not a rebuild. They have a mid-round first pick. It's an attractive job. They're going to get paid. And so we don't have to turn over all these little stones looking for kind of an unsung dark horse candidate. Pick the best guy. Campbell and McDonald are really, I'm not Campbell, but Johnson and McDonald are really, really intriguing. McDonald has been tied. He wasn't involved in this report today of an official request, but Rappaport reported 2 days ago on the NFL Network that they were interested, that he's going to be a candidate. So I would expect that news to come out soon. There's been no ties at all to Johnson, which, there's some speculation that he's already kind of signed and sealed to Washington, that's his preferred spot. He has a connection with the new GM there. He likes the cap space and the second pick and all of that. And that may be true. But man, as a Seahawks fan, you watch what that Lions offense does and you go, that's how our offense should operate with the personnel we have today.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like Jared Goff is Geno Smith, and David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs are Zach Charbonnet and Ken Walker, and he's got all the weapons, and there's pieces to work with on the offensive line. I think that's why fans are drawn to that. But so far, no connections.
Okay.
Yeah, but so if you remove that one connection, Frank Smith is the only offensive coach. All the names that we've talked about, every one of them have been a defensive guy.
Which is fascinating, given some speculation recently, including Mike Holmgren, who came out a couple of days ago and said he was at VMAC. He was talking to the guys there. He was talking to Schneider, and he had a feeling that he wanted to go with an offensive coach. And then we see this list come out, and it's all defense.
Well, okay. I would say that whenever this might be Pete Carroll or it might be John Schneider, but it always felt during the tenure of the outgoing coaching staff, whenever the NFL would zig, the Seahawks would zag. And everybody is going offensive head coach because, that's
because they don't want to lose them.
Yeah. And so because if you have a defensive head coach, you can only win if you have a great offensive coordinator. But the moment you have a great offensive coordinator and you win, they leave.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that's why everyone's going, offensive head coach. But the Seahawks are looking defense.
And I'll say one more thing, Bill, because I know that makes people nervous. That aspect that you just talked about, Keith, that, if you hire a defensive guy, who's the coordinator going to be? And some of these defensive coordinators that are candidates, there's no obvious guy. There's no one on their current staff that looks like a candidate to be poached, or there's no one they've worked with in the past. Like, who would Mike McDonald bring with him? Todd Monken's not going to go from Baltimore to Seattle. Is T. Martin ready to be an offensive coordinator? Then you're going with an unknown guy. In the case of Dan Quinn, that's not the case.
Greg Roman from a year ago.
Yeah, could be, who has obviously ties to the NFC West and all that history with San Francisco, and don't think he worked in the NFL this year. He could be a possibility. With Dan Quinn, that's kind of a package deal. Like, I've just assumed that if Dan Quinn is hired as a head coach here, that Washington native and former Dallas offensive coordinator Kellen Moore would have to be the choice there. And so that's a whole nother discussion too. It's like, okay,
totally.
Now you've checked that box, right? You hire one of these defensive guys, you hire Mike McDonald or Evero or whoever. Well, now what? Because the offense is the best thing they have going for them right now, but you have no leadership.
Okay. So Dan, you mentioned the idea you started to tie in this selection to our own roster, that the Seahawks are a very attractive team to come and coach. And let's start to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's start to talk about our own roster. Let's start to talk about our free agents that are up, our salary cap. Let's talk about Geno Smith a little bit. Let's talk about the idea that this roster is ready to win now with, or does the defense need to be completely blown up? With what we saw, what we witnessed this year was a bottom 3 defense in the NFL by any measure. And, some of that had to be attributed to the players. Which players are responsible? Are they up for free agency? Or are those the guys that we need to reinvest into the new regime that's going to inherit them? So let's kind of open that up for discussion. Keith, what do you think about the roster being ready to win and an attractive place for any coach to want to come and coach here?
You look at all the other head coaching positions that are open, and the most wins out of any of them was, I believe, Tennessee with 5. Seattle had 9. They had a winning record. It's automatically an attractive job, because the 9 wins was a massive disappointment because there's talent there that wasn't being used. You get someone who can come in that can get more out of the same talent, and boom, you got a team in the playoffs. And so I think that is an attractive job, and it's partly an attractive job because of the defensive talent and just how bad the defense was. Because if you can't make a defense with the offense or the defensive linemen that they had, and Boye Mafe, and the cornerbacks that they had, if you can't make that work, then you're doing something wrong. Clint Hurt was clearly doing something wrong. And so they should be able to come in and a competent coordinator should be able to come in and get significantly more out of this talent. Now, it doesn't mean it's not without flaws. I mean, both safety spots are going to need to be fixed and replaced. Maybe not Julian Love, but definitely Adams is where I'm leaning with that. You've got some problems where there isn't, the only leadership on the field was Bobby Wagner, who showed his age considerably this year and just has no speed left. And Brooks is also a free agent. So there's holes, there's things that need fixed, but there's still enough talent here to be a middle of the road defense, even with the holes. And Clint Hurt couldn't get him above 28th.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a pathetic showing by the coaching staff, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it didn't even look like he had the ability to teach or develop. Like they were progressively getting worse, and that's
apathetic.
That's the worst thing you can see from it.
Yeah, they just kind of turned off in the last 4 or 5 games of the season and just didn't even show up, which is really disconcerting. Okay, so let's talk about the salary cap for just a second, and we can kind of wind back around the roster. So currently we don't have much cap. I think it's even a negative cap space. It doesn't really matter here. What I want to really talk about is what could we do to generate cap, and is it a real issue going into free agency this year? I don't think it is. I think it's pretty easy if you do the math. We could get to about $60 million in salary cap if we make a decision on Geno. If we leave Geno out of the equation, we can get to about $40 million. If you take Jamal Adams and do a June 1st designation, there's quite a bit there. Quandre Diggs, you've got 11 million. Will Disley, you've got 7 million available. Brian Monet, 5.9. Jaron Reed, 4.4. Nick Bellore, 2.8. Dwayne Eskridge, 1.4. I totaled that up, including Geno. I came to 61 million, $200,000.
Yeah.
If they decide they want to build a team, or at least short term, around Geno, which I understand. Keith and I have talked about this a few different times, mostly off the record, because we have a little discussion there to be had. But if they decide to stay with Geno, there's still about $40 million that you can generate pretty easily without reworking contracts, without getting into taking a look at Tyler Lockett for example, or DK Metcalf, redoing those contracts to help out a little bit. They could even generate more if they needed to or wanted to be really competitive in year one. And sometimes you want to do that with a new coach, new regime. They've got players that they want to kind of bring in as well to a roster to kind of stamp their identity on this thing. So let's talk about the salary cap. Let's talk about the players and free agency and who's available, who might leave. Who do you want to have come back specifically around like a Leonard Williams, for example? Do you have Bobby Wagner come back or Jordan Brooks? Those are the main players that I want to talk about there.
It's a lot to chew on. I think if you take emotion out of it, right, you forget about who your favorite players are and whose jerseys you own or whatever. It's very simple and it's very streamlined to me. And I think it plays into what we've been talking about, that it's such an attractive position. There's really only two guys that are at question here, and that's Leonard Williams and Jordan Brooks, in my opinion. Everybody else is replaceable. Will Dissly's replaceable. Damian Lewis, even, who will probably walk as a free agent, is a replaceable player, in my opinion. Those are the two guys. And so all the other guys that you might be worried about walking away as free agents are guys that you can replace for the same dollar amount. Really, to me, in baseball terms, they would be a replacement level player. It's Leonard Williams and Jordan Brooks. And so making those moves that you talk about, and those have been confirmed by, I even heard a podcast the other day with Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus, who does salary cap stuff for a living. And he came to those same numbers, that even without touching Geno's contract, you can get to that $50 million neighborhood, right? And even if you want to roll with Geno, you can, because he has 12.7 non-guaranteed in salary this year, you can easily do a bonus conversion. You can just rework that with a simple stroke of a pen and clear $8 more million in cap space and keep him. So
I'm going to stop you really quick,
a lot
Dan,
of flexibility.
And let's have just a quick conversation. Maybe it turns into a longer conversation, but a quick conversation around Geno Smith. Like, what do we do? Is Geno Smith attractive to another head coach?
Could be.
And if not, could he be a tradable asset, for example? Could you rework his number to make him more attractive to be the quarterback for the next 1 or 2 years as a bridge as you try to transition to a younger player?
He should be attractive because I think he raises your floor, right? I think he's a very, very solid middle tier quarterback that you can win with, that just kind of, if you're worried about having to make some major changes on the defensive side of the ball, you can kind of not have to worry about that for a minute, right? He's a solid quarterback. And I would argue that a better play caller could have gotten more out of him. I think if Ben Johnson's the offensive coordinator of the Seahawks, Geno Smith's in the Pro Bowl and he's throwing for 4,500 yards. That's how I feel about him. Everything you see Jared Goff doing on the field, I think Geno Smith is capable of doing as much, if not better. I've been back and forth on him, but the last 7-8 games of this year, not just the numbers, but the eye test and what he looks like to me is he took a step forward. And so that's a luxury for an incoming coach. You can still draft a guy, but you don't have to worry about starting over at that position if you have some other things that you have in mind. So that's where I sit on Geno Smith. He should be an attractive quantity for anybody coming in.
I don't think he's an attractive quantity for someone coming in at $31 million. You
can change that.
You've got a 34-year-old coach or quarterback with a gaudy cap number compared to his talent, and I don't think that's attractive. I mean, does it raise the team's floor? Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't. He doesn't have the high ceiling. He's not a guy that's going to win you, 13 games and take you to the Super Bowl. But he will stop you from losing more than 7. You know what I mean? Like, or having your win total be under 7. So sure, there's some attractive there, but you've got to get the next guy up because he's already going to be 34, and
absolutely,
you're not going to have, if he's going to be a bridge. Let's say you're going to draft a quarterback, you're looking at having a guy that you want on the field by mid-season, right? Any first-round quarterback that you draft, you want them on the field, so that way they're ready for next year. Are you paying Geno Smith $31 million to start you 8 games?
Two
absurd.
Answers to that for me is if he does carry, if they don't touch his contract at all and he carries that $31.5 million cap hit, right, for next year, if, as we've detailed here, you can still clear $40 to $50 million in cap space without touching his deal, then how much more do you need? I mean, that would allow you, if you want to bring back Leonard Williams and Jordan Brooks, if the new coach should so choose, and still be able to fill out the rest of the roster. But I think the bottom line is, if you do choose to bring Geno back for another year, that you absolutely rework his deal. And that was part of when he signed the deal. There was a lot of like, well, it's an easy out after one, and that's the focus. It's black or white. It's in or out. But I've always looked at it as, it's not just an easy out. It's easy. It's flexible, and they can easily change that. But I look at what the Green Bay Packers did yesterday, and I was never a big Jordan Love fan. I just didn't see the appeal of it in the limited amount of times we got to see him play. But he looks elite and he looks legit, and they didn't feel the pressure to play him year one. And I kind of, we can talk about what they should do with that 16th pick, and we will between now and April. But man, that's an attractive thing when you see how they manage that there, and not having to pressure a guy and taking your time with someone.
When I take a look at this head coaching choice, there is no head coach, including John Schneider, that's going to want to start the season with a rookie quarterback and a new regime that's got a ready-made roster, quote unquote, that's ready to win. That's why I think you've got to run Geno back at least one more year. If you're smart, even if it's at that 31 number, I think you can do a number of different things on the roster, salary cap, to manipulate that, to fill out your roster in other spots, especially paying attention to the defense if you had to. Because I think it's that
we're going to find out in 31 days how they feel about that Geno contract and what they're going to do about it, because they have to make a decision.
March 18th, I believe, right?
February 16th, day after the Super Bowl. Okay. That's when that 12.7 becomes fully guaranteed. So, and you did that just real quick. You asked about trading him. I think in any other year, with as many quarterback needy teams as there usually are, that he would absolutely have some attraction, some value to someone looking for a bridge quarterback. Not this year, not with 6 first-round quarterbacks available and kind of a historically deep quarterback draft, even going into the mid rounds. Not this year. I think any team looking to make a change at quarterback this year is going to roll with a rookie.
Wow. Interesting.
Which just takes his trade value and basically.
So let's talk about that 16th pick overall real quick. We've traded away our second round pick. I think if you could get something for Geno, you could potentially get a second round pick in return for him, maybe a second and a fifth, something like that. I don't think that would be unreasonable.
In a normal year, that's probably his value. Yeah.
You're probably going to be lucky to get a third for him in this year.
Oh, come on now.
Who would it be? Who would it be? Right. And you try to find a team that would want to roll with a veteran and do the bridge thing. And really the only team, all the teams that need quarterbacks are looking for rookies. The only team that makes sense to me is Tampa Bay, because you have the connection with Canales and they feel like they have a roster that's built to win now. But they like what Baker did, and they would probably just as soon re-sign him with a much lower 2024 cap hit on a new deal.
Yeah, or you can get one of those first round pick quarterback teams to spend some money on an expensive bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it all depends on coach. If Bill Belichick goes to Atlanta, right? He may want to find a veteran. Right. He may not want to start all over again like he did with Mac Jones and go with a rookie. So it all kind of depends on where guys land. But
sure.
Yeah.
So talk to me about your Dan. Talk to me about your roster building theories around a mid-round, first-round pick, and where you would go with that, considering our roster considerations. Do you kind of build in the trenches where Seattle got beat over and over and over and over again, both offensively and defensively? Or do you go and get that quarterback that's really hard to get at the top tier talent level? You might have to reach a little bit at that spot at 16, maybe to get a quarterback that was going to be, mid to late first round or early second round. What do you do there?
It's going to be fascinating. And you guys know me, I've already done a bunch of mock drafts, and although I haven't done any in the last week because I just don't have a feel for what they might be looking for. Right. Mm-hmm. 16 is an odd spot to be because the top skill position guys are gone. If you want to, okay, let's take running back and wide receiver off the board. I think we can all agree they're not going to be hunting wide receiver or running back. Not tight end either, unless Brock Bowers were to slip to 16, which isn't going to happen. So you're looking quarterback or trenches, right? And quarterback just got more interesting to me with JJ McCarthy declaring for the draft. I believe, and I haven't dug into deep film study on all these guys yet, but I believe there's going to be 6 quarterbacks drafted in the first round this year. And so
Wow.
the addition of that 6th brings 16 into play, whereas before he declared, when you're looking at 5, you can see a scenario where all 5 are gone by 15. But maybe the addition of a 6th changes the dynamic, especially a guy that's uber talented, but most GMs might agree might need the Jordan Love plan, right? Might need a year or two to kind of sit and learn and develop a little bit more physically because he has a slight frame. And so that, if they may be faced with that decision, that opportunity, that Jordan Love decision at 16. If a guy falls to you that you're in love with and you have a chance to lock up what you feel is your franchise quarterback long term, you do it. Otherwise, I'm going offensive line or defensive line. The problem with this draft is there's really only one defensive tackle we're taking in the first round. It's probably not going to be there by 16 in Newton out of Illinois. So then you're looking at edge players. We all kind of feel like they're pretty deep there, and some of that depends on fit with the new coach. And so to me, if today my preference is, and it kind of plays into the strength of this draft too, is I'm getting a mauler on the offensive line somewhere, a guard or a guy that can play right tackle in case Lucas's knee isn't right. They have to address that position group still.
The good news is it's deep there.
Yeah.
I mean, the offensive line is probably the highlight of this draft early, and often offensive tackle, interior offensive line for sure. You mentioned a couple of edge rushers. Yeah, there's going to be a few available, but I don't know Seattle needs to go that way as a high pick. But boy, do they need help in the interior offensive line and potentially at right tackle. I agree with you.
I mean, we'll have to see, a new coach, Keith, you can speak a little bit more eloquently than me, I'm sure, on this, on the defensive side of the ball. But if a new coach changes the defensive scheme, right, goes back to more of a 4-3, then the roster might not match personnel wise. And our edges that we have now might not fit as 4-3 defensive ends. Right. And so depending, of course, on whether they bring Williams back. And so they may be hunting edge at 16 because it's a guy that fits that scheme a little better. So,
well, and if they just assume it's Dan Quinn, right? Dan Quinn runs a 4-3, not a 3-4. And so those outside linebackers, Boye Mafe, who was like the standout player on the front 7 this year, is not as good of a fit in a 4-3. So does he end up in the Bruce Irvin role on the strong side, or the KJ Wright role on the weak side, or do they just go right, left, and let the opposing formation dictate who's up at the line and who's not? We don't know. Yeah. But he can do those things. He's got some flexibility, but he's not truly the edge player that you're thinking of. I mean, Darrell Taylor, who has been kind of a disappointment the last 2 years since they moved to the 3-4, is a body built for a 4-3, who's been playing out of position for the last 2 years. And that's only part of the problem. Part of the problem's between the ears, I think, as far as his ability to recognize what's going on. But there's just different needs. And so, where does Uchenna Nwasu fit in a 4-3?
Yeah, Leo, I guess, if Quinn's going to run that old kind of scheme, sort of that hybrid. Yeah, that's a tough one.
I mean, does he go there, or does he play the Bruce Irvin side on the opposite, the Sam linebacker? So
then begs the question, and we're going to get into all this in a couple of months, is, okay, what if the new defensive scheme, what if Nwosu's not a fit? Well, suddenly now you have a pretty attractive trade chip, and all of that stuff starts to happen. So
yeah. Also, you go into a 4-3, you got a true middle linebacker again, and Bobby Wagner maybe looks a little bit more attractive because he only has to move, forward. He doesn't have to go sideline to sideline as often.
True. That's interesting. You did ask about Bobby earlier, and I didn't address it. And I would just say this: I think anyone other than Dan Quinn gets this job, and we've seen the last of Bobby in Seattle. I think Quinn coming on is probably the only chance that he gets another year.
Well, and I think Quinn coming on might get him another year, not because he thinks Bobby's going to be like an all-pro again, but because he knows he needs leadership, and he knows he needs guys that can help him in the locker room and those kind of things. And he knows that Bobby's that guy.
Yeah.
When they signed Bobby this year, they didn't think he was going to play, 95% of the snaps. They were thinking that he was going to play 50 to 60% of the snaps and be the second middle linebacker that comes off the field in the nickel. And that just never materialized because everyone else was either bad or hurt. And so they had to put him out there. If you switch up the defense, you switch up his role, you bring him back where he can be the captain, the leader, all those things, but not be on the field 100% of the time, you're really getting a lot more value out of a guy like Bobby Wagner.
Yeah.
Interesting. So I think I've covered pretty much all the topics that I was going to kind of bring up in this show. Did you guys have anything that you want to talk about before we get out of here?
I'm curious to know if you guys, because I flip flop on this every day. It's easy to get enamored with the unknown, as we touched on earlier, right? In some of those hot young coaches, which you mentioned it at the top of the show, Bill. But for those of you fans watching this who are just so excited because you think you've identified some hotshot coordinator that's going to be the next stud head coach, just real quick off the top of my head, Brandon Staley, Arthur Smith, guys that were hot candidates 2 years ago, already fired. Nathaniel Hackett, 1 year in Denver, right. He was a hot candidate. You know what I mean? It's be careful what you wish for. But I'm curious to know if you guys had to pick today, if you had to put money on who you think the coach is going to be, is it Quinn? Is it that simple? Or do you think John wants to kind of start his legacy out with a curveball and surprise us all and do something a little more bold?
Well, if his draft record is any indication, whatever you think is the most obvious route, he's going to pick something different. I think if I'm putting money down, I'm putting money on Quinn. If you take Quinn off the table and say I can't pick him, I'm picking the guy in Baltimore, whose name slips my mind right now because I don't have it up in front of me anymore.
Mike McDonald.
There you go. I just think that what they do defensively and what he's done specifically there, plus he's the young, guy.
Shut down the 49ers offense.
Yeah. Just destroy
Plus, just a little bit of a tidbit too. I mean, if you're thinking about, because usually when coaches leave programs, they bring some guys with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Ravens have a couple really, really, really interesting defensive free agents this year and may not be able to afford to franchise them with what's going on there with their salary cap and Lamar Jackson and Justin Madubuike and Patrick Queen. If you want to hire a guy, maybe instead of Leonard Williams and Jordan Brooks, he prefers those two guys. I'm just saying that might be something that he brings up a time or two in his interview.
Well, right. And one of the things that we've already talked about is if you're going to hire a guy like that, he's got to bring in an offensive coordinator.
Yeah, staff.
And because you got to put, right. You're also, if you're hiring a guy that's that young, one of the things that Sean McVay did, which really made his first couple of years easier, was that he went and got Wade Phillips, who was the old guy who'd been a head coach multiple times, to be his defensive coordinator and really give him someone to lean on in terms of learning how to be the guy. He was only there for a couple of years, but he only needed him for a couple of years.
So I like your Roman idea, a guy that's a veteran, proven offensive coordinator who has a really good history of running the football and working with young quarterbacks.
What about Frank Reich as another option?
I thought about him initially
as an offensive coordinator, not as a coach, head coach.
When he was fired
as an OC, maybe.
That this seemed like the widespread speculation was he was ready to retire. But man, if you can talk him into, sticking around, that'd be an interesting one too.
The other wild card name I'd throw out potentially as somebody with some experience would be Jim Schwartz, defensive coordinator with the Browns.
We'd have to trade
good track record against Shanahan teams. If you brought him as a head coch.
No, you could bring him in as a if you hired an offensive coordinator, you could bring him in as a defensive coordinator as long as you gave him an assistant head coach title. Because then it's a promotion.
Would you want that hanging over a first-time head coach though? That's an issue. But
I talked about that the other day.
It's an interesting point, Bill. I mean, he's a guy that was, players loved playing for him in Detroit.
He's got a hell of a record against Shanahan coach teams.
Kind of rebuilt that
like
thing,
8-1.
Right? Yeah. I have not heard him linked to any coaching vacancy at all or having any interview requests. That's interesting.
He's got the Browns defense looking good. Yeah, I think, Schneider brings in Dan Quinn to basically verify his priors, and to see the growth firsthand. Like Dan Quinn's been through a lot since he left this organization. And has that made Dan Quinn a better head coaching candidate? And I think it has. And I think when Dan Quinn gets an opportunity to get in front of John Schneider, I think it goes well, actually.
I think he'll have a plan.
I would be shocked if it wasn't Dan Quinn.
He's going to have a plan. He had head coaching opportunities.
He's been waiting for this moment for a while.
For sure. Yeah.
He's had head coaching interviews the last couple of off seasons and has turned them down. Like he's
pulled his name out of the
Yeah. He wasn't going to just go anywhere. He wanted
some fans are going to hate it. Some fans are going to hate it, and some media might even too, that it's just continuation of Pete Carroll. But I would ask those fans
it's hard to move on from Pete. It's hard to move on from Pete Carroll and go to Dan Quinn. It is. Yeah. It's going to be hard for anybody. Let's be honest.
And what I would say to those people is, two completely different individuals. First of all, the whole thing that like it's just going to be a continuation of Pete. Well, Pete was a legendary coach, right? Might have a shot at the Hall of Fame. But I would say this: I would ask those same fans that don't like this move, if it happens, that do you think that defense would have been better if Dan Quinn was coordinating it last year?
Hell yes.
I think it would have been. I think we agree on that. As a minimum, right? As a bare minimum, as a floor. I also think it's a guy that's hungry to get another shot, has had an idea of how he would run his next organization when he gets a shot. And as Keith pointed out so perfectly at the beginning of the show, for anyone who thinks he failed in Atlanta, and I get that a lot from fans the last couple of days, I don't want another failed head coach. First of all, Pete Carroll failed, Bill Belichick failed, Bill Parcells, but go back and look at the drafts in Atlanta from 2017 to 2020, and tell me how many impact players there were in those drafts, especially on defense, which is Quinn's wheelhouse. And there's maybe two guys in all those drafts.
He didn't have personnel control.
Right.
It's not like here where, you can.
It was a Dimitrov, I think, was the GM there at the time.
Yeah. You've got a bad draft, you can put it partially on the coaches because they're involved and all of that. There, they weren't. They were just, here's your roster, go. And the roster was terrible those last few years.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I guess the thing that I think we'll find out quickly, right? I think if by the Cowboys getting upset yesterday changed the dynamic of this coaching search for the Seahawks. If Dan Quinn's the guy that John Schneider wants, and he goes through the proper process in this interview process, make sure they satisfy the Rooney Rule and all that, which they clearly are by their candidate list. If Dan Quinn is the guy that they decide they want, I think he's going to make a definitive decision. I think we'll know potentially in the next 48 to 72 hours. He's not going to go, okay, Dan, hey, thanks for the interview. We're going to wait this out and see and wait. I don't think there's
a wild card here. I think there's a wild card, and that's Jerry Jones and Mike McCarthy. And does Mike McCarthy lose his job because they can't make it out of the playoffs? Great regular season record. And does he have Dan Quinn come in to be the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys with that roster?
First part of that question, yes. I think absolutely Jerry Jones is going to fire. He's going to fire Mike McCarthy. I think his comments after the game yesterday were pretty telling, and it's same old. He needs a guy that can win in the playoffs. But I don't know, man. Jerry Jones loves the big fish. He loves the big whale, and with just handing the job to Dan Quinn. I think Bill Belichick.
Bill Belichick is the big whale. He's the guy. Because my concern
maybe Harbaugh, but probably Belichick.
When they started getting pounded in that game, I'm like, well, Quinn's going to be available. But my instant thought was, but if they go out too early, then he's going to be the guy that gets promoted in Dallas. But then I thought about it, and I'm like, no. If Belichick hadn't been let go, then I think we'd have something to worry about. But I would be surprised if we go 24 hours longer from after we're done recording this and we haven't got news that McCarthy's out and Belichick's interviewing. I'll be surprised.
Yeah, same.
Wow, crazy. Lots of changes. Lots to look forward to. I mean, this is just a huge offseason for us. I mean, we're all going to have a great time. I mean, Dan, you're doing a great job with your show, Seahawks Forever Podcast. You've got great guests on. You know your stuff. That's why you're here. Love to have you on and talking about all the things. I will definitely like to have you back as we go through not only free agency but leading up to the draft, because it's just great to have you in the room and run these things by you as well. Tell everyone what you're up to, what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for the kind words. Always great to be on with you guys, and I'll have to get you on my channel as well. At Seahawks Forever on Twitter. Seahawks Forever is the name of the show. YouTube channel, all audio podcast platforms. And we talked about a little bit about it before we hit record today. The off season is a different animal than the regular season, and in some ways, I like it better because during the regular season, you get into a routine. It's very repetitive. You're reviewing the last game, you're previewing the next game, you can hit on some storylines as they develop. But the off season is more of a guest driven time of the year on my show. And I like interviewing other podcasters, members of the media, reporters who cover the team, occasionally a player or an ex-player. This week, I've got some cool guests as well. As soon as I'm done here, I'll be inviting Maddie Brown and Griffin Sturgeon of the Overload podcast into my show. So if you love X's and O's, we'll dive into that with some of these guys and get their thoughts on the regime change. Both those guys have been pretty optimistic and positive when it comes to what Pete Carroll and his staff were doing, and thought that they were just a couple of tweaks away from being good. So it'll be interesting to hear how they feel about a total change. Rob Staten has agreed to come back on the show with me again soon. And I look forward to getting some other people on here as well coming up. So just keep an eye on Twitter. It's the best way to keep up with things at Seahawks Forever.
Nice. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate you. You can find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL. You can find me at NW Seahawk. The show is Seahawks Playbook Podcast. You can find us on your favorite podcast platforms and YouTube. And when you find it, hit the subscribe button, share it if you like it, leave a great comment. We'd enjoy those. And until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Thanks, guys.
Seahawks Playbook Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.